Brazil is widely considered to be the greatest football nation on earth, and for good reason. The Seleção have won the World Cup 5 times, which is more than any other national team, and can count the likes of Zico, Pelé and Garrincha among their raft of former greats. There is a saying in Brazil that the English may have invented football, but we Brazilians perfected it. And even as an Englishman, it used to be hard to disagree. I grew up in awe of the yellow, green and blue of Brazil, a colour combination which my dad, who works in clothing, assured me shouldn't work, but Brazil were able to pull it off and make it iconic simply because they were so good. I caught the tail end of the brief Ronaldo and Romario strike partnership, perhaps the most talented front two that this sport has ever seen, but it was the 3 Rs of Ronaldo, Rivaldo and Ronaldinho who defined the Brazil team as I started to take a serious interest in football. If such a thing as perfection existed in football, it was hard to imagine that it didn't look something like this. At the first World Cup that I can remember watching, in 2002, Brazil beat England in the quarter-finals, en route to lifting a record-breaking 5th World Cup. This was just what Brazil did. Except, they haven't done it since 2002, over 20 years ago now, and for anyone who is just a little bit younger than me, they won't have grown up with the same perception of Brazil as untouchable perpetual winners. Over half of Brazil's most recent squad, in fact, aren't old enough to remember Brazil ever having won the World Cup. Meanwhile, Endrick, Vitor Roque, and Andre Santos, touted as Brazil's next great prospects, hadn't even been born yet. At the last 5 World Cups, since 2002, Brazil have only reached one semi-final. On home soil in 2014, where they were thrashed 7-1 by Germany in the heaviest semi-final defeat in the history of the World Cup. The 2006, 2010, 2018 and 2022 World Cups all resulted in quarter-final exits for Brazil at the hands of France, the Netherlands, Belgium and most recently Croatia, a nation of just 4 million people. This is considered a national humiliation in Brazil, a country of over 200 million people, where football isn't merely a popular pastime, it is a national obsession. Even in the Copa America, Brazil have won just one of the last 5 tournaments since 2011, in a run which has included successive quarter-final defeats against Paraguay and a shocking group stage exit at the Copa America Centenario in 2016 from a group consisting of themselves, Haiti, Ecuador and Peru. Despite repeated setbacks, heartbreaks and disappointments, Brazil was still the tournament favourites heading into the 2018 and the 2022 World Cups. Clearly, therefore, Brazil still has lots of talent, and both internally and externally, expectations of the national team remain sky high, but performances and results continue to fall well short. So just what on earth is going on? Well, in today's video, that's exactly what we're going to try and figure out. Why hasn't the world's most successful national team won the World Cup in over 20 years? What has gone wrong with Brazilian football as a whole? And are they likely to win it again anytime soon? Brazil have only actually won one more World Cup in the men's game than Germany and Italy, and fewer Copa America titles, 9, than either Uruguay or Argentina, who are each tied on 15. There is a reason why Brazil's national team, beyond just being 5-time world champions, is still considered to be the pinnacle of the international game though, and that is because of how they won those tournaments. When Brazil ruled the world, they weren't just a ruthless winning machine, they were a joy to watch, and they often won emphatically. Nothing better encapsulated that than Brazil's 4th and final goal against Italy in the 1970 World Cup final. The Italians were flat out on their feet by that stage, in the searing heat and humidity of the Azteca Stadium in Mexico City, exhausted firstly from their 4-3 win against Germany in the semi-finals, just 4 days earlier, which went to extra time, and secondly by a Brazil team that left them chasing shadows for the last 45 minutes. Inside his own half, Clodaldo slalomed past 4 Italian players before lending the ball to Rivellino. Rivellino looked down the line to Jairzinho, who found Pelé in a central position. Pelé paused for a moment, awaited the inevitable marauding run from his right-back Carlos Alberto, who never seemed to tire, and teed up a perfectly weighted pass for the Brazil captain to thunder past Enrico Albertosi in the Italy goal. It was the perfect embodiment, in a single goal, of what the Brazilians call o jogo bonito. In English, the beautiful game. Brazil's 1970 World Cup winning team is widely considered to be the greatest national football team ever to have existed, though recency bias and the advent of colour television likely played a significant role in that. Man for man, Brazil's 1958 and 1962 World Cup winning teams were arguably even more formidable, and had blown teams away even more emphatically. In 1958, Brazil scored 10 goals across the final and semi-final against Sweden and France, and they never scored fewer than 3 goals in the knockout stage in 62. What united every winning Brazil team from 1958 to 2002 was their flair, exuberance, and uniquely Brazilian style. Even in 1982, when Brazil went out in the second group stage, they still played the best football and were most people's favourite team. Brazil's historic style, sometimes referred to as Ginga or Samba football, is based upon what has more recently become known as relationism, in contrast with the positional styles of play that are more common throughout Europe. In fact, most of Europe's best teams are now rigidly positional and extremely disciplined. No one encapsulates that better than Pep Guardiola, the most successful European coach of them all, who takes incredibly gifted footballers and gives them very disciplined instructions as to where he wants them to be and what he wants them to do in different phases and patterns of play. That's why players so often take time to adjust to Guardiola's demands after he signs them. Just take Jack Grealish, who was one of the best players in the Premier League in the 2020-21 season, hence why Manchester City paid a then British record £100 million to sign him. At Villa, although Grealish operated off the left flank, he was given relatively free roam to drift around, pick up space, and maximise his individual impact upon the game. Here is Grealish's heat map from the 2019-20 season and from the 2020-21 campaign. Compare that to Grealish's heat map at Manchester City last season, and indeed, in his debut campaign the season before last. Guardiola wants Grealish to hug the touchline, stretch the game, retain possession, and drag his team higher up the pitch. Grealish has less expected goals and expected assists, and actual goals and assists, in a far superior Manchester City team than he did at Aston Villa. But that's not his primary role anymore. Above all else, Guardiola wants control. And, for the last 6 months at least, Grealish has been able to provide him with that as just one cog within a machine, which is why he starts almost all of Manchester City's most important games now. That is an anathema to the Brazilian view of the game. A player like Grealish, or more to the point, Neymar, Antony, or Rafinha, playing alongside other great players, should be given the freedom to go out and express themselves. Great teams with great players ought to be able to dominate possession and sustain attacks, but outside of that, they should have the fluidity, understanding, and relationships with their teammates, hence the name, to be able to develop their own spontaneous movements and patterns of play. It is a more natural way of playing football, if a little bit more chaotic. It's how most young Brazilians are still taught to play the game, both within and outside of academies, and as the style of play that caused most Brazilians to fall in love with the game in the first place, it is how most still feel that football should be played. In light of Brazil's plight at the World Cup over the past 2 decades though, an internal conflict has emerged between the o jogo bonito style that made Brazil great and the more disciplined, positional style of play adopted by most of the world's top teams now. At the last few World Cups, from say 2014 to 2022, it feels as though Brazil have tried to find a confused compromise of retaining relationist improvisation in attack whilst remaining organised and disciplined out of possession. Against lesser opposition, it has proven to be highly successful. Brazil lost just 1 game in over 3 years against Argentina in the 2021 Copa America final before the start of the 2022 World Cup. in the 4.5 years and more than 40 matches between losing 2-1 to Belgium in the quarter-final of the 2018 World Cup and the start of the 2022 World Cup, Brazil only twice conceded more than one goal in a 2-2 draw with Colombia and a 4-2 win against Peru. Brazil's 4-2 defeat to Senegal in their most recent international constituted the first time that the Seleção had conceded 3 or more goals in a game since the 2014 World Cup, 9 whole years ago. When the going gets tough, though, against elite-level opposition in the knockout stages of a World Cup, it is not as though Brazil crumble. All of their post-2002 World Cup exits, barring 2014, have been by very fine margins, nor do they concede loads of chances. But they struggle to retain control, that crucial word, synonymous with Guardiola and the best positional style teams. Against Croatia in Qatar, Brazil created the better chances and probably should have won the game in normal time. They had 11 shots on target to Croatia's 1, and on another day, either they would have been more ruthless in front of goal or Dominik Livakovic wouldn't have been quite so brilliant, but they never truly dominated the game or looked to be in control. In fact, Croatia actually saw slightly more of the ball than Brazil, by 51 to 49%, and completed more passes, 694, to Brazil's 684. For all of Brazil's attacking flair, with Vinicius, Neymar, Rafinha and Richarlison, their two-man midfield of Casemiro and Lucas Paquetá could never quite get to grips with Marcelo Brozovic, Mateo Kovacic and Luka Modric, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the numerical advantage Croatia had in there and the calibre of those three midfielders. It has also become more difficult for Brazil to retain their unique style and identity when most of their best players no longer play that way week in, week out in Brazil. It's often forgotten that the phenomenon of South American internationals playing almost exclusively in Europe is actually relatively new. Brazil's entire 1970 World Cup winning squad played their club football in Brazil, and even by 2002, the last time that Brazil won the World Cup, over half of their squad, 13 players, still played in Brazil, including the likes of Dida, Kleberson, Gilberto Silva and Kaká. Of the 10 players who did play overseas, half of them, Ronaldinho, Edmilson, Roque Jr., Denilson and Jr., have been playing in Brazil within the last 2 years. At the 2022 World Cup, by contrast, only 3 members of the Brazil squad still played their club football in South America, namely third-choice goalkeeper Weatherton, twice-capped forward Pedro, and veteran Flamengo winger Everton Ribeiro. I don't necessarily agree with the sentiment, expressed by a lot of Europeans who work in football, that Brazil must adapt, or worse still, modernise, if they want to get back to the top. And tactics in football tend to be cyclical, but it is undoubtedly much harder for Brazil to retain their style when most of their players haven't played that way at club level for a number of years, and unless there is a major shift in global football dynamics away from Europe and back towards South America, which doesn't seem imminent at least, that is unlikely to change anytime soon. An often unrecognised challenge for the Brazilian game, I think, is the recent hegemony of the Premier League. During the 1990s, 2000s, and even into the 2010s, when Brazilians moved to Europe for more money and a new challenge, most of them went to Italy or Spain, or sometimes Germany, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Far fewer tended to come to the Premier League. If you look at the great Brazilians to have starred in La Liga, whether that be Ronaldo, Romario, Rivaldo or Ronaldinho, or in Serie A with Cafu, Kaká and Falcao, you are talking about sometimes era-defining players in those divisions. The Premier League has had some very good Brazilian players before the 2020s, most notably Juninho, Gilberto Silva and Fernandinho, but they don't quite fall into that same bracket. There are perhaps more cultural similarities between some countries in continental Europe and Brazil, and less of a language barrier in some instances, but more importantly, the style of play represented less of a radical shift from what they were used to than playing in England. The Premier League, meanwhile, has always been renowned for its physicality, the fast pace with which the game is played, and a general sense of breathlessness that isn't found almost anywhere else. Now that the Premier League has become so dominant though, particularly financially, the best Brazilians are inevitably flocking to English football's top flight. At the last World Cup, almost half of Brazil's squad, 12 players, played for Premier League clubs. There were as many Manchester United players in the Brazil squad as there were players who played in Brazil as a whole, and more in their starting 11. There were more Newcastle United and West Ham players than there were AC Milan, Inter Milan, Bayern Munich and Barcelona players. This is a radical shift, and it's something that Brazil is most likely going to have to get used to. Brazil still produces more outstanding teenage footballers than any other nation on earth, but the most outstanding of them all tend not to stick around in Brazil for long. The likes of Rodrigo, Vinicius Jr., Gabriel Jesus, Rainier, Paulinho, Gerson, David Neres, André Santos, Douglas Luiz, João Pedro, Kaikai and Gabriel Martinelli were all signed by European clubs before turning 20 years old. On the one hand, it means that Brazil's best young players typically start competing at the highest level and training with top-class players from a very early age. On the other hand, it means that they often struggle to get games, sometimes stunting their development, and they are imminently reprogrammed, if that word doesn't sound too dystopian, into playing a different style of football. The consensus in Brazil is that, on the balance of things, it has had a detrimental effect on the development of Brazilian players, and therefore the Brazilian national team, and obviously, the strength of domestic football in Brazil as a whole. It's not just the most talented wonder kids that are plucked from the Brasileiro, though. Increasingly, it is players of all ages and of varying degrees of talent or potential, leaving because they can earn more money elsewhere. Over 3 times as many Brazilians have played in or are playing in the Chinese Super League than players from any other country outside of China, and there are over 5 times as many Brazilians in the Saudi Pro League, or who have featured in the Saudi Pro League, than players from any country other than Saudi Arabia. Since the Saudi state significantly ramped up investments in football, chiefly for domestic propaganda purposes, the likes of Fabinho, Roberto Firmino, Malcolm, Talisca, Alex Telles, Paulo Victor, Vitinho, and most notably of course Neymar, have all made the desert their new home. A raft of Brazilians also play in Mexico's Liga MX, where salaries are often higher than in the Brasileiro, particularly for mediocre players, as well as in lesser European leagues, whether that be in Moldova, Russia or Ukraine. Not only are those players playing at a worse level than they would be if they were either in the Brasileiro or in a leading European league, it means that those young players who aren't immediately snapped up at 17 or 18 are graduating into a lower quality league system. As well as the standard having declined in recent years and decades, domestic football in Brazil is also increasingly chaotic. A cocktail of crazed directors, ludicrous managerial turnover, and a totally unmanageable schedule have conspired to render Brazil's domestic game barely functional at times. Managerial stints are no longer managed in years or months, but in matches. The confluence of state, national, continental, and sometimes even worldwide championships can conspire to create a schedule whereby some teams play as many as 70 or even 80 games in a single season, and the timing of most of the world and, crucially, Europe's transfer windows means Brazilian teams are routinely stripped of their best players midway through their own campaigns. It's a harsh environment for youngsters to be thrown into, where sympathy tends to be in short supply from supporters with high expectations, and the same is true of the national team. Brazil has expectations unlike any other national team in the world. It might be the case that a handful of teams, Argentina, France, Germany, Spain, England and Italy, when they actually qualify, go into World Cups hoping that they can win it, and with a fair amount of belief that they will reach the latter stages when they have a competitive team. Most Brazilians, however, go into every World Cup not hoping, but expecting that Brazil will win. At each of the last 5 tournaments, Brazilian fans and pundits have talked about adding that 6th star to the Brazil badge before a ball has been kicked, but on each occasion, they have been left disappointed. There is a saying in Brazil which basically translates as, the only team that can beat Brazil is Brazil themselves. That is to say, whenever the national team loses a game, very little credit or even acknowledgement tends to be given to the talents or performance of the opposition. The focus is almost entirely on Brazil and their own faults. It is a belief rooted in the supposition that Brazil ought to win every game, and that if they don't, they obviously did something badly wrong. No one is more expectant or demanding than Brazil's sporting press, who ramp up expectations to fever pitch on the eve of every tournament, and are practically foaming at the mouth if the Seleção don't touch back down in Rio with the trophy in their hands. In fairness, Brazil aren't alone in expecting a lot of Brazil. Pre-tournament, in 2018 and 2022, as I alluded to in the introduction, Brazil were the favourites to win the FIFA World Cup. Brazil still have great players, they tend to come into tournaments in fantastic form, and the history and tradition of the Seleção perhaps gives the rest of the world a slightly distorted perception of their own vulnerabilities. It should also be noted, and just hear me out on this one, it might sound a bit crazy, but it is actually extremely difficult to win the World Cup. It sounds simplistic, but it is remarkable how often that fact is forgotten, particularly in Brazil, but also elsewhere. It's why I always find it strange when people point out that Gareth Southgate hasn't won a major trophy yet, as though that illustrates that he is useless or massively out of his depth, as though England routinely won either the Euros or the World Cup before he took charge. Brazil might have found it easier to win the World Cup in the past than anyone else, and have remarkable pedigree. But even they missed out in a stunning upset against Uruguay on home soil in 1950. They went 24 years without tasting success between 1970 and 1994, and the reality is that in over 90 years, there are only 8 countries that have ever won the Men's World Cup. In the modern era, there isn't any one national team capable of blowing everyone else away, or there hasn't been for the past 2 decades at least. To win the World Cup, you need talent, spirit, and, crucially, a slice of good fortune. Outside of the 2014 World Cup, which was the weakest Brazil squad to go to a World Cup during my lifetime, and I strongly suspect of all time, Brazil have consistently been one of the top 5 or 6 teams going into a tournament, and they haven't spontaneously combusted like Germany at the last 2 World Cups, going out in the group stage, or Italy, who have failed to even qualify. And it should be said that they are the next 2 most successful teams in the history of the World Cup. Brazil won their group in Qatar, they thrashed South Korea in the round of 16, and they probably should have won against Croatia, despite not being at their best. Had they taken their chances against Croatia, they would have made it through to a semi-final versus their great rivals Argentina, and who knows what the outcome of that match would have been. In Russia in 2018, Brazil lost, again, by only the narrowest of margins against Belgium in the quarter-finals. Brazil had 59% possession in that game, completed 144 more passes than Belgium, had twice as many corners, 27 shots to Belgium's 9, and 9 on target, compared to Belgium's 3. Every failed World Cup campaign is full of hard luck stories, and it was a reasonably tight game. Let's not pretend that Brazil battered Belgium or anything, but it is just another illustration of the fine margins in football. What's more, France, Belgium and Brazil were almost certainly the 3 best teams at that tournament. It just so happened that 2 of them met in the quarterfinals. If you were looking for glaring weaknesses in the Brazil squad though, both fullback positions, centre forward, and an over-reliance on Neymar have been long-term problems. It is very strange for Brazil, who have historically produced more great fullbacks and centre forwards than any other country in the world, that they are having such trouble there. Brazil have lacked a truly world-class number 9, probably since Ronaldo played his final game for them, other than his testimonial, at the 2006 World Cup, and even he was way past his best by then. Adriano looked to be Ronaldo's heir, just as Ronaldo had succeeded Romario in 2004 and 2005. But a hole in his ankle and in his soul, as he put it, meant that the Emperor's fall was even more rapid than his rise. Since 2006, Brazil's starting World Cup centre forwards have been Luis Fabiano, Julio Baptista, Fred, Gabriel Jesus, and Richarlison. All 5 either are or were very good footballers, and I am by no means intending to denigrate them in any way whatsoever, but I don't think that it is an exaggeration to say that if they were born into almost any era of the Brazil team prior to 2000, some would have done well to win a handful of caps for the national team, let alone lead the line for Brazil at a World Cup. There was a time when Giovanni Ibar was the main man at Bayern Munich, winning the Bundesliga Golden Boot, and could only win 15 caps for Brazil. Ailton scored 34 goals in a single season at Stuttgart and never won a single cap. Grafich bagged 35 goals in Wolfsburg's Bundesliga winning season and still only won 4 caps. Afonso Alves only won 7 caps despite scoring 48 goals in 50 games in the Netherlands with Heerenveen. Mario Jardel scored a frankly outrageous 170 goals in 175 games for Porto and 67 in 62 for Sporting and still only won 10 caps. Ricardo Oliveira couldn't stop scoring goals at both Betis and Zaragoza in La Liga, but could only muster up a miserable 16 caps. Sonny Anderson is the 6th highest foreign scorer in the history of Ligue 1, having won 3 Ligue 1 Golden Boots with Monaco and Lyon, and a Ligue 1 Player of the Year award, and for that he was rewarded with an almighty 6 caps. I could go on, but you probably get the idea. And that is to say nothing of the countless prolific forwards Brazil used to have in their own, once extremely competitive top flight, such as Tulio, Washington, and Ramon Menezes, who hardly ever got a look in for the national team. In short, Brazil used to be spoilt for choice at centre forward, whereas now they're just, well, short. Brazil's number 9 at the 2022 World Cup scored 1 goal in 27 Premier League games at Tottenham last season. 20 or 30 years ago, that wouldn't have gotten you an attacking spot in Brazil's C team. It is a similar story at fullback. Through Nilton Santos and Djalma Santos, no relation there, Brazil effectively invented attacking fullbacks, or at least popularised them on the world stage. Since then, they have had the likes of Carlos Alberto, Leandro, Branco, Marinho Santos, Roberto Carlos, Cafu, Marcelo and Dani Alves. It's not just that Brazil don't have anyone of that calibre anymore, they now have inferior fullbacks to almost all of the world's leading national teams with whom they are competing for the World Cup. Danilo, Renan Lodi, Alex Telles, Emerson, none of them are bad players, but nor would they get in the England, France or Portugal squads. As much as Neymar may cut a controversial figure among some people, whether that be because of his injuries, career choices, or support for Brazil's far-right former president Jair Bolsonaro, or a combination of all of the above, there can be no doubt that he is, and has been for over 10 years now, one of the best footballers in the world. Given the fact that Neymar was touted for greatness from the age of about 14, and there have been no other generational Brazilian talents within his age group, the weight of expectations on his shoulders since childhood must have been unbearable. Just to have become one of the world's best players then, and Brazil's joint highest goal scorer tied with Pelé on 77 goals, at least as far as FIFA is concerned, is pretty remarkable. Sometimes it feels as though the expectations of Neymar would be impossible for any player to fulfill. It's often pointed out that Neymar hasn't led Brazil to glory at the World Cup, and doesn't have iconic World Cup moments like Ronaldo, Ronaldinho or Romario. But the burden on those players was always shared. If, for whatever reason, Romario wasn't quite at the races, he had the likes of Babito or his old strike partner and enemy Edmundo alongside him. If either Ronaldo, Rivaldo or Ronaldinho had a bad day at the office, the other 2/3 of the combination were there to pick up the pieces, with Kaká, Juninho and Denilson waiting in the wings. Neymar will be 34 years old by the time the next World Cup comes around, and could well have spent the last 3 years living like a king in Saudi Arabia, and playing a vastly substandard level of football. He may well still be part of Brazil's squad, he might even still be a key part of it, but it would seem ill-advised to assume that Brazil will still be able to build a team around him, especially when, even in his prime, and playing in the Champions League with PSG and Barcelona, Neymar alone wasn't able to carry Brazil to the World Cup. In a recent video that I made about Mexico being world football's biggest underachievers, I talked about how competing in the relatively weak CONCACAF Confederation, rather than CONMEBOL, had been detrimental to Mexico's footballing pedigree and development over the past century, if not still in the present day. That is true, but perhaps the dirty secret of the Americas these days is that CONMEBOL has problems all of its own. Argentina may have won the 2022 World Cup, but they are the only CONMEBOL nation to even win a quarter-final at either of the last two World Cups. At the last World Cup, Argentina and Brazil were the only two CONMEBOL countries to even make it through to the knockout stage. Ecuador and Uruguay were both dumped out in the group stage, and the fifth CONMEBOL national team in qualifying, Peru, failed to even make it to Qatar, following a playoff defeat to Australia. It was the first World Cup since 2006 in which fewer than 5 CONMEBOL nations qualified, and the first since 2002 in which fewer than 3 CONMEBOL sides made it through to the knockout stage. It is indicative of a broader trend that we have witnessed in football in recent years, in which UEFA has gradually become more and more dominant, and CONMEBOL, the only region and confederation that once could, has struggled to keep up. The reality now is that whilst Uruguay continue to punch well above their weight given their tiny population, outside of Argentina and Brazil, there are no formidable CONMEBOL national teams. That could obviously change in the future, but right now it's a problem, and it might explain, at least in part, why Brazil have gone into both of the last two World Cups in outstanding form, and having qualified with ease, only to find non-CONMEBOL opposition like Belgium and Croatia to be much trickier customers. Brazil is a cash cow for CONMEBOL, and indeed their own greedy and routinely suspect Brazilian Football Federation. But if Brazil want to be ready for that kind of opposition on the biggest stage, the most obvious solution is just to play them between tournaments. Just on a side note here, it must be said that the travel and fixture schedule for Brazil and Brazilian teams can be incredibly grueling. South American teams have to play 18 matches from Caracas on the coast of the Caribbean Sea in Venezuela to the unbearably high altitude of La Paz, Bolivia, en route to qualifying for the World Cup. European teams, by contrast, only play 8 or 10 games, typically while clocking up far fewer air miles en route to the biggest tournaments in world football. It's a similar story in terms of domestic football in Brazil, which is itself almost the same size as Europe on its own, but operates a nationwide league and competitions. The combination of games and travel isn't ideal, let's just say, in terms of fitness development and performance levels. Following Brazil's 2022 World Cup exit, Chiche, who had been in charge since 2018, stepped down just as he had promised he would, regardless of how Brazil performed. Brazil's under-20 coach Ramon Menezes took charge of Brazil's next 3 matches, which didn't exactly go to plan, 2 of them ended in defeat, before Fernando Diniz was appointed. Any questions about Brazil adopting a more positional or European style were silenced with Diniz's appointment. During his short time at Fluminense, his team has adopted relationism and a Ginga style of football in its purest, most distilled form, winning a state championship and climbing from 7th to 3rd in the Brasileiro in the process. Except, Diniz's appointment is hardly final. The CBF objected and is being referred to as an interim head coach, claiming that he is a full-time appointment overseeing a transitional phase, but the fact of the matter is that he has only signed a 1-year deal, which will end before the 2024 Copa America, and he is still employed by Fluminense, juggling both roles at the same time. Carlo Ancelotti has long been touted as Brazil's long-term choice from 2024 onwards, and as the man to take Brazil into the 2026 World Cup. Whilst the idea of a foreigner managing Brazil, something which has only happened for 9 matches in the entire history of the Seleção on a permanent basis, would have seemed unthinkable not long ago, but increasingly, some are warming towards the idea. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and in a lot of ways, Ancelotti's appointment would make perfect sense. Of all of the great European managers at top clubs, he is the least positionally prescriptive in his approach, and the one who affords his star players the most freedom. He's also a proven winner, having won league titles in all 5 of Europe's Big 5 leagues, in addition to 4 UEFA Champions League titles with AC Milan and Real Madrid. From Ancelotti's own perspective, he has basically completed club football now, age 64, and a World Cup, which Brazil could offer him a great chance of winning, would give him a clean sweep before sailing off into retirement. As far as Brazil are concerned, Ancelotti's appointment is signed, sealed, and he will be delivered in 2024, right on the eve of the next Copa America. Sources in Madrid, by contrast, claim that no such deal has actually been agreed, and only informal interest has been expressed at this stage. It is a slightly bizarre situation. Ednaldo Rodriguez, the president of the CBF, has already publicly announced Ancelotti's appointment, but there has been no official comment from either Real Madrid or Ancelotti himself, other than Ancelotti commenting, "If it's true that a national team like Brazil want me, I like that a lot, and it makes me happy." End quote. It seems probable that the move will materialise, but until then, it leaves Brazil in a continued state of flux following the fallout from the 2022 World Cup. Brazilian football faces an identity crisis, domestic chaos, capital flight, an over-reliance on an ageing superstar with no obvious replacement, a lack of continental competition, a greedy and incompetent federation, and managerial uncertainty. And despite all of that, they are still one of the best national teams in the world. This isn't the finest hour for Brazilian football, by any means, nor the finest 2 decades, but it is only a crisis by the ludicrous standards that Brazilian football sets itself. In some ways, and this won't be a popular comparison, Brazilian football feels a little bit like English football did when I grew up in awe of the Seleção. The talent is there, they still have some great players, but they lack identity and belief, and there is an expectation, or even arrogance going into tournaments, that leaves the nation with egg on its face. It is a sense of staleness, stagnation, and mindset that can be tough to shift, full of hard luck stories entwined with nostalgia. Brazil are in much better shape than England were at their lowest ebb, but expectations are even higher, and the longer that the wait for that 6th star goes on, the more intense that burden will become. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on both for this channel and my second channel, both of which should be on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, and all of those links along with my link tree should be down in the description below.